Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. And Happy New Year as well. Since we recently had a look at the average life of a Chaos worshipper, I figured we might have a look at what it's like to be an average Imperial citizen as well. Now, fortuitously, we do know a fair bit more about how Imperial citizens live than Chaos citizens. Less fortuitous is the fact that there is really no such thing as an average Imperial citizen. Life can vary significantly just from one end of a planet to the other, never mind the other trillion worlds scattered across the Imperium. But we will, as usual, do our best to generalize without losing too much detail. So let us begin with a universal factor, something that you're going to be seeing on pretty much every single solitary Imperial world. An economy. Obviously, even in the far-flung future of the 41st Imperium, trading food and services for shiny discs of metal, or occasionally numbers on a digital account, remain the most prevalent way to acquire aforementioned goods and services. Although there is no truly unified Imperial economic system. At the very least, not in terms of a generally agreed upon fiat currency for the entirety of the Imperium. Now, there is obviously going to be generally agreed upon rates of exchange, at least between systems that frequently conduct trade with one another. Otherwise, that trade would literally be pointless and impossible, as nobody could ever truly agree on what anything was worth, and in what currency the goods should be paid for. There is probably some form of more or less universally agreed upon form of mineral currency, a la the likes of gold, silver, and diamonds on Earth, things that will always have automatic value. Now, the moment we start exploring space, of course, many metals become significantly more common, and so this would more likely be something like osmium, for example, or thulium. Minerals that are precious simply due to their scarcity. Otherwise, planets that frequently conduct trade with one another will no doubt agree upon some form of an exchange rate. On the smallest level, this would allow Planet A to trade easily with Planet B, so that traveling merchantmen, whether they be sub-light speed or even warp-capable vessels, can visit Planet A and pick up their local currency, and exchange it at Planet B for an equivalent amount of local currency at Planet B. Obviously, the Imperium is huge, and with access to faster-than-light travel via the warp, this system will usually be expanded upon quite significantly, to the point where we know that there are huge swaths of the galaxy who all use a fairly unified currency, such as, for example, throne gelt, which is used in the Calyx sector and in many other sectors besides, although a throne gelt from one sector might not technically be quite the same as a throne gelt from another sector, as it is a general name for a currency that has been in use across the Imperium for a very, very, very long time. But you might now be wondering, what the hell does this have to do with the average Imperial citizen? He's not likely to be a trader or a merchantman, is he? Well, he could be, of course. But more than likely, you are indeed correct, and he is going to be but an average citizen. But average citizens are, of course, all unified in their need to continue to stay alive. And the way you stay alive is by purchasing food, by purchasing a house, accommodations, by paying for all of the countless little things you need in your day-to-day life. And how do we do this? Well, via money, of course. Money that we earn whilst going to work. And There are plenty of jobs in the Imperium, all of whom need doing equally desperately, lest the entirety of the Imperium collapse. Well, slight exaggeration perhaps, but you get the general drift. And hey, if you don't get any pay, your universe might as well collapse, as there's probably not a whole lot of social services in the Imperium. There's going to be some on well-to-do, rich worlds. There's going to be some element of basic social security, possibly. But on something like a feudal world, or a feral world, a tribal system, well, the only social security net you'd be likely to have would, if anything, be immediate friends and family. Certainly nothing from the government. And considering that a lot of the more developed worlds, too, are basically authoritarian, feudalistic societies, well, feudal lords tend to not be over-eager to share what they themselves view as very limited resources with worthless, wasteful, lazy peasants. So in this particular regard, staying employed, the Imperium and our real-world day-to-day life are not so different. But, of course, how you get paid could vary significantly. Say, for example, that you are on a forge world, or something with similar harsh living conditions. You may not be paid in money at all. You may simply be paid in necessities. For example, the portion of gruel you are granted mid-shift. That is your payment. A small paper slip giving you access to another ration of gruel later that evening is a part of that payment. Being given a small domicile that you share with 5 other laborers might be your payment. You might simply just exist as another cog in the machine, with very little, if any, freedom beyond that immediate role. In such an environment, the currency would simply be, well, whatever the planet would give you. It would be your food stamps, for example. And certainly there would be a certain underground economy as well. Perhaps you could trade in your food stamps for additional luxury goods that are only available to higher ranking workers, who might use your food stamps as a way to trade for even greater luxury goods in bulk with others even more highly ranked workers. As even on a forge world, of course, there are going to be differences between the various stratas on the forge world. The Magos of the entire planet is not going to be eating the same gruel as everybody else. Or, well, in the case of the Adeptus Mechanicus, where they might simply have replaced all of their taste senses, they might, but you get the general idea. There's going to be some form of a black market economy, and there might even be some locally crafted currency with which you can engage with that economy. Say, cogs, for example, locally minted from an underground person that started as a criminal currency. And it might even be deeply illegal, but, well, the reason why we still use money is because it's just a lot easier than bartering. And that, too, is why this system is likely to be somewhat rare, and only really used on things like Mechanicus Forge worlds. Because, at first blush, you might think that, oh, well, this is the perfect way to do it. If all of your citizens are merely just cogs in the machine, various forms of fleshy apparatuses only required to carry out a certain job, then why wouldn't you just feed them whatever they need, and then be done with it? Well, it's because it's actually quite complicated on a logistical scale to keep everybody fed equally, especially taking into consideration things like births and deaths, etc., and the constant fluctuations in the requirements of productivity lines. One cycle, you might need so and so many tons of food. But as you're required to increase productivity, you need so and so many tons of food, which has to be taken into consideration every time you expand a production line. If there are any shortfalls, either in the production of food or the production of resources, you again need to take a look at this. If you're going to scale down production, same problem. It's simply one more step of the logistical process that the administrator needs to take care of. Whereas simply handing out X amount of money is comparatively simple. You don't need to organize food, you don't need to organize multiple meals, you don't need to organize the distribution of food at set areas after hours, etc. You can simply allow the civilian market to take care of it. It's easier. And it might not even sound like it, but in every example in real life where we were attempted to do this, to basically run everything from the top, particularly when it comes to food production, we've pretty much near universally got it wrong. And, well, here's the bigger problem. If you severely miscalculate how much food is required to feed your workers, best case scenario, you are going to have a lot fewer workers. Worst case scenario, the workers will take their continued nourishment into their own hands, usually by eating the overseer. Thus, most planets prefer a more hands-off system, where instead of a centralized government running everything, there can be room for local businesses and entrepreneurs, though usually on a smaller scale level. Like if you want to set up a food stall selling skewered rats, for example, charred to just the right point, where you can't even tell that you're just eating a furry rodent anymore, then you can probably just do so. Maybe there's some permits involved or something like that, and there might even be an overarching organization that takes care of this, but 9 times out of 10, it's simply going to be too much of a bother, unless you're something on a little bit of a larger level, in which case guilds are the preferred ways for most worlds to run their economy, where you might have something like a literal carpenter's guild, or a machinist guild, or a woodworkers guild, or a las rifle producers guild, or a tank producers guild, etc. These guilds will gather together the various skilled laborers required to produce whatever it is they're making, and that can often require a fair bit of expertise. In many cases, therefore, the guild will have an, in essence, monopoly on that particular product, allowing the guild to become very, very wealthy and also quite politically influential, which will in turn lead them to continuously cement their own position. Once you've got a guild system, it's difficult to get away from it, and in most cases, it's not really necessary or desirable either, because this blends the both of two worlds. Relatively centralized control, without the guy in top having to bear all of the administrative burden directly on his own shoulders. Indeed, one could quite easily argue that even the largest organizations within the Imperium are, in essence, guilds like this. Take the Administratum, for example. It is a huge, overarching organization that employs specialists to carry out whatever duties it is required to do. It even has its own internal rank systems and a hierarchy within itself. And you might, of course, immediately then argue, but isn't it just the government? Well, sort of. But the Adeptus Administratum is not a traditional government in the way that we would view it, as it doesn't really take care of the running of individual worlds. That's not what it does, that's not its role. Its role is the overall running of the Imperium at large, which is a whole different ballgame again. In fact, one could even argue that local governments are kind of like guilds too, in that they are specialized in taking care of their particular planet, and the Imperium doesn't really want to get involved. See, this system of decentralized control simply means that whether it be the ruler of a planet or the ruler of a system, he doesn't go to the factory itself and go, listen, I need you to increase lasgun production by so and so many percent. Instead, he simply approaches the guild or its representatives and say, okay, you need to increase production by so and so much. And then they will take the necessary actions required to do so. This is far more effective than approaching individual factories or individual owners of conglomerates of factories when you're talking about something on, well, the planetary scale. As for the guilds themselves, again, they can be pretty much any sort of guild, but they will most likely pay their workers. Now, this can also be with various forms of luxuries or accommodations. It is quite common, for example, for the Adeptus Administratum to provide domiciles to their servants, and one of the rewards for climbing the ranks is a larger or even possibly a private domicile. Rather extreme luxury in an Imperium where space comes at quite the premium price. There are also those who are going to pay their workers in things like rations too, and especially the more greedy guilds will definitely find some way to reach into their employees' payment check and subtract whatever necessities they require, like pickaxes for the miners' guild, or buckets licenses, etc., etc. But in theory, at the end of the day, our Imperial citizen will come away with some sort of a paycheck for local currency, whether that be thrown gelt or something far more local. For example, certain tomb worlds utilize literal bones as currency, with bones with particular carvings having more value, or bones that come from revered individuals being of particularly high worth, etc., etc. With this humble paycheck in hand, our Imperial citizen can then go to the market, which will probably operate like most usual markets. In fact, we know there are entire trade conglomerates that run public air markets, or even indeed entire trading houses and sectors within things like hive cities, where if you've got the money to pay, virtually anything and everything can be purchased, including valuable off-world luxuries, though those are obviously usually reserved for the higher classes of society, due to the simple fact that transporting a banana from one continent to another is already difficult. Transporting a banana from one solar system to another, significantly more so. There are also cases in which guilds have constructed entire cities and their own trade districts and areas for their employees to utilize. We even have a few examples of that in our real world too, where companies grew so large and so powerful that they constructed entire cities to supply themselves with labor. In these cases, the company might often pay a part or indeed the entirety of the paycheck in the form of some local guild currency, like a promissory note or a script, for example, saying that you are owed for so and so many work hours, for example. But again, in theory, you can buy whatever is on offer and is available to you for that money. This obviously does give you a far greater degree of freedom than the Mechanicus drone who's only ever paid in gruel, because you could then go and purchase that banana if you saved up enough script or throne gelt or whatever. You could theoretically go on a vacation. We have examples of this in several books where civilian families will save up for extended periods to take trips to places across the planet, or simply just remarkable sites nearby. Then is also sometimes the potential to grow money as well via investments, although that's significantly rarer. There are a few examples throughout the books of tales of people going, well, full rags to riches, building their own trade empires over the course of generations and so on. And theoretically, you absolutely can. You can buy a banana over there and sell it over there until you've sold so many bananas that you can start purchasing the better bananas from the planet next door and so on. But usually the payment allotted to the average worker is quite sparse, and more often than not, it will be barely sufficient to sustain a person's life or a small family, and there probably isn't going to be all that much left over. This comes as a side consequence of the centralized nature of most of these planets' economic systems. They are, well, usually quite turgid and stagnant. If you have a bunch of monopolies possessing, again, aforementioned monopoly on whatever it is they're doing, it's difficult to really branch out on your own. And even if you did and you were sufficiently successful, well, in all due likelihood, somebody's going to take offense at that and is going to come over to break your kneecaps because you're getting ideas well beyond your status there, sir. And even in the cases where worlds allow for significant self-improvement, it's usually something that takes place over a very, very, very long time, and only during exceptional circumstances. As there are also planets, of course, where there can be a great deal of economic growth in a short time. For example, a space Hulk. Now, normally, space hulks are bad news for the systems that they visit, occasionally occupied by demons, tyrannids, or orcs, you know? But equally as often, although less talked about, are the empty space hulks. Those huge amalgamations of twisted metal and starships floating through the void who, due to the extreme hostility of living half of their time inside of the warp and the rest in the cold desolation of space, doesn't have anything unfortunate living on it. Or if it does, then at the very least not enough of unfortunate things to make them a serious hazard to an entire planet. In these cases, a Hulk will be claimed by the nearby system. It will be purged of whatever unfortunate things live on it, and then various contracts are handed out to people who will then be allowed to exploit the Space Hulk, stripping it of rare and precious resources, or even indeed technology. This can be an enormous boon for a system, a huge injection of resources, and the instant creation of millions of jobs. And seeing as there is still a monetary economy, this will see some growth. Although, again, seeing as most of it will go to guilds and, family members, etc., it's on a far lesser scale than one might see in a proper capitalist system, but the opportunity nevertheless remains. It's just, limited. But what is the worth of money without anything to actually spend it on? So, let's talk about another pretty universal thing that all Imperial citizens are going to need. Food. Now, as we talked about with the Forge world, this might be, fairly simplistic fare. And on quite a few worlds where food is a precious and rare luxury due usually to absolutely absurd population numbers, the staple foodstuff is probably going to be something pretty disgusting, like just gruel or a watery soup or a nutrient paste or, occasionally dead people, although that tends to be more of an extreme measure rather than a staple foodstuff due to the problems that eating people tend to have on other human beings. But there are absolutely the occasional planet out there that has resorted to a little bit of recycling to, beef up the rations to avoid hunger. Especially as, well, again, the problem with large-scale hunger is twofold. Best case scenario, you'll have a lot fewer people and the hunger will kind of solve itself. Although you are now going to have a hard time reaching your productivity goals. Not to mention, of course, meeting the Imperial tithe. And failing to meet that one is a pretty big deal. They unseat planetary governors for that, so, it's something you'd rather want to avoid if at all possible. And worst case scenario, on a planetary scale, well, let's just say that the primary recruitment tool for chaos is not, contrary to popular belief, simply going up to the average Joe and going, "Hello there, citizen. Would you like to spend your life worshipping Demon Dick McRape's children?" Because that is usually a pretty hard sell, even within the Imperium of Man. No. It's usually something along the lines of, "I have food." Well, which again can be a very, 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 very persuasive argument. Naturally, therefore, most planetary governors who wish to remain planetary governors, either by, imperial decree or vox populi via pitchfork, will try to ensure a relatively stable food supply. Whilst indeed there are planets that have, bi-weekly food riots as just a common occurrence, this is not a desirable state of affairs. And most planets with a decent food supply will have access to a fair bit of varied foodstuffs as well. Now again, this varies largely on the sheer quantity of people on the planet and what the planet produces. On a hive city, for example, food that isn't nutrient-rich, sugary slop is going to be pretty damn rare, simply because food is going to be pretty damn rare. But on an agri-world, where the entire point of the planet is to produce food not just for itself, but for the rest of the Imperium, foodstuff is going to be fairly common and fairly diverse. You're going to have access to vegetables, to bread and corn products, maybe even some meat if you're lucky. Now, the grox is the primary livestock used for food within the Imperium, and there are a lot of grox in the Imperium. A whole heaping heck of a lot of grox. So grox meat in and of itself is probably relatively common, and it's something that even on a hive world, you could probably get a hold of at least, once or twice a week or something. But meat is definitely going to be considered, at the very least, a little bit of a luxury resource for the majority of the Imperium's citizens. Now, of course, if our citizen in question happens to find himself on a nice agri-planet or merely a slightly built-up civilized world, then it'll be a lot more common. Things like fish, naturally occurring animal resources, would probably be exploited to pretty much the maximum, and preferably not beyond, as, well, you can fish the oceans empty. Chinese have demonstrated this fact. But obviously, if you are on a planet rich in natural resources, be it fertile soil or animal life, you are going to have a way better food situation than on a hive world, where the only naturally occurring animal creature is, well, Rottweiler-sized rats that steal children in the night. There is also going to be a fair few other consumable luxuries that kind of falls under foodstuff-ish, like recaf, coffee, basically. That appears to be a fairly common staple across the Imperium, or at the very least some variant of it. Probably most of it isn't actually made from, the whole beans thing. It's probably some sort of substitute that achieves more or less the same goal, but coffee in its many varied forms would be quite common across the Imperium. Things like tea as well. In fact, there are some planets, of course, that prefer tea over the coffee as a recreational beverage. The famous Tana tea in the Cyphus Cain books is one example of this. And due to the fact that things like these are usually fairly easy to transport en masse, and also tend to be quite, durable for long-term storage, their price is likely to not be absurdly high. Probably within reach of the average Imperial citizen on most planets. And on many worlds, it might be the only luxury they have access to, along with maybe a few teaspoons of sugar on a weekly basis. And speaking of sugar, things like baking, that's another thing. There are going to be a lot of planets that obviously do a lot of baking, whether it be professionally via guilds producing bread for the masses, or locally in the home. Again, a world that has some form of currency will, in theory, allow its workers to purchase whatever the hell they want with that currency, including, obviously, the ingredients you need for baking things. Indeed, on many Imperial worlds, I imagine this is going to be the best and easiest and most affordable way to gain access to more luxury-style baked goods, like cakes, for example, which would probably, if actually bought done, be ruinously expensive for most citizens. Now, obviously, this also presumes that you have somebody that has the time to bake, which is not at all a certainty. Again, many of these worlds are basically exploiting their human resources to the absolute limit. Say that you have a family, for example, a husband and a wife and a couple children. In virtually every circumstance, the overwhelming majority of Imperial worlds, both of them will be in full-time employment. In fact, both of them will probably be in near endless employment. On the average large-scale hive world, for example, it is not at all uncommon for a person to go to work for like 12 hours, go home, sleep for like 6 or 8, and then get up again for another 12-hour shift, with only a handful of hours in the day allowed for one's private amusement and enjoyment. When we also take into consideration things like logistics, needing to go purchase things, for example, or simply just going back and forth between one's workplace, there really is not going to be a whole lot of time left over for leisure, or even activities like, for example, baking. I imagine on many hive worlds, for example, there's probably going to be some sort of local cooperatives doing this, where the older members of the larger community take care of things like that, whilst everyone who is still fit to go to work, just go to work, and that is pretty much their entire existence. And the children themselves, they'll go to school for a brief period of time, probably, but not for any real length. And I suppose this kind of leads us into the question of education. Naturally, one would assume that the best way to acquire access to more luxury goods, whatever they may be on the planet in question, low sticks, tobacco is another common example that seems to be so frequent that most planets have some sort of variant of it, and honestly, considering the work-life balance I just described, recreational drugs are going to be very frequent on pretty much every single solitary Imperial world. It doesn't need to be the same kind, but there's going to be something, I guarantee it. Human ingenuity and the natural need to find something to enjoy is going to guarantee for there to be a booming distillery business, or even indeed straight up drug labs on pretty much every single planet you can imagine. But, again, we'll simply just classify that under the fairly generalistic term of recreational drugs, as again, it's going to vary from what you've got access to, be it things like hallucinogenic funguses from the underhive, or even more traditional things like spirits on an agriculturally oriented world. But again, one would think that the best way to get access to more of this would be to get a better job. How does one get a better job? Well, one obviously needs to know how to do that better job, which means getting an education. But is there even such a thing as an education in the Imperium? Well, yes, surprisingly enough, there is a relatively robust education system within the Imperium of Man, at least on a basic level. It turns out that making sure that most Imperial citizens are at least capable of reading is rather beneficial, both in terms of simple communication person from person, but also in order to allow them to read religious scripture, of course. And so pretty much all Imperial citizens are educated with a solid grasp of Low Gothic and basic mathematics, because again, it simply makes society flow easier. There's probably also going to be a lot of religious teachings, general indoctrination, and probably, I'd imagine, a fair bit of martial education too, or, well, propaganda, basically, with many worlds probably having something the rough equivalent of extracurricular activities, where the kids can go to learn things from the PDF, for example. That sounds really bad in a particular context, but it's not that context in this case. The Planetary Defense Force. Yes, let's go with their full name in this particular case, shall we? But higher education is going to be a lot rarer, and will usually be reserved for the aristocracy or those who can pay, probably, I'd imagine, rather extortionate costs for it. As the Imperium, well, it really doesn't need 5,000 people with gender studies degrees. That's simply not necessary. Not in the far future, or indeed right now. What the Imperium needs is laborers. They need people capable of standing by a conveyor belt and packing pieces of product into boxes, for example. They need people who can work a mine shaft, and on occasion this too will require specialized knowledge. This specialized knowledge is then usually taught via the guild's system, or even by things like apprenticeship systems. Say, for example, that you have a form of skilled labor. Like, say that you are assembling the final product. You are given all of the pieces that have been manufactured previously, but it's up to you to put them all together in a way that makes sense and actually, makes the thing work at the end of the day. This will require some tutoring, possibly even some understanding of the technological aspect of what you're doing. Although, considering the Imperium's approach to technology and the Adeptus Mechanicus, etc., aforementioned knowledge is likely to be pretty limited. Nevertheless, you do have to know that that piece goes there before that piece goes there, and finally that piece goes over there so that when you push the button it goes whoosh, or whatever else. These skills will then most likely be taught either within the guild itself, having their own workshops or tutelage systems, or they'll be taught via apprenticeships systems. Say, for example, and this would be more along the lines of manual labor-esque jobs that are easy to teach. Say that your father was a miner. On many worlds, it would then be fully expected that that father's children would also be miners. And so, once the kid has received his basic education, he can read and write and speak understandably, he'll be taken down into the mines with his dad to be taught his job. And because even something like that does require a fair bit of actual knowledge. Being a miner is not quite so easy as to pick up a stick and strike the wall with it until coal falls out. There might be a whole host of specialist tools, or special procedures required, or if you're going to play with explosives to open up new veins and so on. All of this does require a fair bit of teaching, and obviously, what better teacher than the guy who's been doing it successfully for the last 20-odd years? This, however, obviously does not fix the problem of getting a better job, though. In fact, if your daddy was a miner, and you'll be a miner, and your son'll be a miner, well, you'll only ever really be miners, won't you? And the best you could ever possibly hope for is becoming the very best miner that you could possibly be. And whilst there is some societal advancement even within that limited basis, like becoming the mine chief, the crew chief, for example, or being given responsibility for an entire mine shaft and so on, it's not quite the advancements we were looking for, obviously. So how does one break this cycle? Well, like through so much of human history, it really just simply comes down to who you know. If you can identify the correct phallus to fellatio, then your chances of getting a higher education and a better life in general increase dramatically. As even within a solidified guild system, you could very well have the child of a miner become a, say, mechanic's apprentice, so that he'll work the machinery crushing the coal rather than digging it, which would be one step up. Maybe his son again could work the shop front, where they, contact the customers and actually sell out the coal in quantities. And he then, his son, might become the local manager of the outlet, or etc., etc. So there are elements of social advancement even within this society, but yet again, they are pretty rare, pretty few, and pretty far between as well. There are going to be some worlds with significantly greater societal flexibility, but, well, how do I put this? More often than not, that will be as a direct result of there being a lot less people around. Quite simply put, if suddenly a bunch of desirable jobs open up, that's probably because the orcs have visited recently and murdered about 75% of the populace. And speaking of killing on an industrial scale, there's another potential opportunity for self-aggrandizement. Joining the Planetary Defense Force, and potentially the Imperial Guard. Now, there are some planets out there where even if you join the military, it will be controlled near exclusively by the noble classes. Absolutely. There are indeed worlds out there where common-born men are not even allowed in to the army. But on most worlds, joining the military is an actual, genuine opportunity to advance oneself, as war is an amazing leveler. Not only do one's betters often die, gloriously leading the charge, but it is an area in which genuine competence and merit are usually highly valued, even potentially within regiments that tend to focus far more on blood and lineage rather than capability. There are often limitations on this as well, of course, especially if you're in a more noble regiment, but in the average Imperial Guard formation, it is entirely possible for a lowly lasman to rise all the way to the rank of commander of his own regiments. Again, rare, but it does happen, although, well, full-on regiments might be more difficult, as usually the commanders of large-scale formations are imperial nobility that have been given access to the specialized training required to lead large formations, and on very few worlds is that kind of education commonly available to just everyone. But still, in others, You are, however, going to have to abandon your world, your family, your clan, and your entire life in order to try. A steep price to pay. And I suppose at this point we're beginning to deviate quite significantly from the life of the average civilian, aren't we? So let us instead move on to a semi-related topic, namely that of entertainment. Because obviously there's going to need to be some form of entertainment, right? Human beings literally go insane without it. We've run experiments on this. Basically, the more intelligent a creature is, the more entertainment it requires to remain sane. And if deprived of entertainment for a sufficient long period of time, first, the creature will attempt to create its own entertainment, and if not even that is possible, it will simply go fucking crazy. So, human beings, being relatively intelligent, will absolutely require some form of base-level entertainment. It doesn't even necessarily need to be much. It could be something so simple as a card game, or spotting strange cloud formations, or impurities in the metal fittings that you're counting by hand, as a member of the Forge World's counting staff or something. But some form of entertainment will always be required by all but, well, lobotomized servitors. So even Forge Worlds would require something along these lines. Now, we do know that the Imperium has television shows. This was told during the Cyphers Cain books, where his various exploits were televised. Romanticized, aggrandized, and blown out of all proportions first, obviously, but still televised. This tells us that most of the entertainment within the Imperium is probably basically propaganda, but filmed in such a way as to be, well, fun. And hey, propaganda can be funny. I've watched enough Chinese movies to know that. And if these are all things presented as if they are just the plain facts of the day, in a society that think the orcs are the worst thing ever, then the 20 feet tall imperial hero that can fire balls of lightning from his eyes, scything down the green-skinned menace, will probably become pretty gosh darn popular, yes. Other forms of entertainment on a more basic level might be things like radio. You could easily install loudspeakers all across the Forge world, blaring out inspirational hymns or devotions to the Omnissiah. As I imagine, religious rites and recitals will also make up a significant portion of the entertainment, with lighter things no doubt being on the menu as well, like popular singers or songs from across the Imperium. A private individual's access to this entertainment can, and I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear this, vary greatly. Yes, I know, but it remains true, doesn't it? Some worlds will have access to holotapes, video cassettes, basically, within the average home where people can watch recordings or even indeed like television broadcasts. Other places, the most advanced piece of home kit for entertainment might be a radio. On yet other planets, it might be books, or comic books in essence, or things like the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, as there will absolutely be local entertainment industries as well. The example in Cyphers Cain seemed to suggest that the TV show was on a far larger scale, broadcasted to many planets, but something like a local author might create novels for the local market, writing about things from that area. Or you've got another form of entertainment as well, which is simply just local tradition, folk dance, local songs, or telling one another myths and scary stories around the campfire deep in the forests of Tarnith. Not to mention, of course, the variety in instruments and songs like bagpipes or harmonicas or whatever else the planet has. No doubt as well, even on Forge worlds, assuming that the locals haven't been entirely, tinkered with to the point of being more machine and men, you are likely going to see some form of this, like dance groups in the Smelter Gang, or a particularly skilled singer that works the conveyor belt on level 12C, and so on. Entertainment also has the obvious effect of distracting the masses from just how incredibly shit everything is, and a fair few worlds do have large-scale sports arrangements as well, though these do require a fair bit of resources, of course, and are usually found on the more like straight-up civilized worlds, rather than on hive worlds or factory worlds dedicated to output. But entertainment is absolutely available, and in some cases, downright nearly plentiful. Which brings us to another topic, holidays. Will there actually be a moment for one to entertain and to enjoy all of the fun and games available to an Imperial citizen? Well, sometimes, yes. Even on planets that work you practically to the bone with 12-hour shifts every single day, there are nevertheless going to be universally observed holidays. One of these is Sanguinalia, which signalizes the death of the Primarch Sanguinius. This is a holiday that is observed throughout pretty much the entirety of the Imperium, and it would be a backwater feral world indeed that did not have this as a holiday, where at the very least your 12-hour shift would be a measly 8-hour shift instead. Something. And planets will have their own local holidays and celebrations as well, celebrating the name of a particularly famous general, for example, or the day the Space Marines came to save their world from the Dark Eldar menace, and so on and so on. And plentiful of religious holidays too, both with a grander imperial significance where the Ministorum themselves declare a day to be a holiday, or of local significance, the birth of a saint or the death of a particularly prominent priest. All of these little holidays provide the hard-working men and women of the Imperium with a sorely needed break, and hopefully keeps them nice and orderly and not smashing windows or shooting local police officers. Which leads me to another topic, the law. How does the average citizen interact with Imperial law? Well, most of the time he doesn't. The actual law of the Imperium, that enforced by the Adeptus Arbites, is quite rare. It usually only has a proper presence on major planets, capital worlds, or huge hive worlds, where there may be a central command hub, an Arbites precinct house. Otherwise, there are entire solar systems and sectors that are patrolled by a single Arbites officer, who only really exists to interfere when required that Imperial law take precedence over local law. As in 90% of circumstances, disturbances are handled locally. And it requires something pretty damn special and in direct violation of the Lex Imperialis, the overarching imperial law, for the Arbites to step in directly. Yet again, because it's simply just easier this way. It's far more sensible for a planet to create its own laws dependent upon its own special circumstances, be they societal or natural. A world covered in eternal darkness is going to have a different definition for a curfew than one covered in eternal sunshine, and so on. And rather than bother with writing a specific exception for every single one of the trillions of worlds in the Imperium, it simply makes a lot more sense for each planet to take care of its own legislation. In many instances, there will also be some higher examples of legislation. For example, there is the Corpus Praesidium Calixis, which is the legal code of the Calis sector. Thus, this legislation covers damn near 200 imperial worlds, and will usually also only be enforced in sector-level stuff. Again, there will be local law, then there might be sector or system law, and above all of this again is imperial law, which mainly concerns itself with large-scale sweeping edicts, such as, for example, the Crimson Accords of Mars, which forbids all production and all research into abominable intelligences, or the Decree Passive, which famously forbids the ecclesiarchy from having any men at arms, but not women, thus leading to the creation of the Adeptus Sororitas. There are also planets where the Arbites are the primary source of law enforcement, usually massive hive worlds, but even then, they usually just enforce the local law. Obviously, of course, the Lex Imperialis overrides all other laws, whether it be local laws, system laws, or sector laws. The law of the Imperium is supreme, obviously. The law itself is mostly intended to regulate larger things, at least on the Lex Imperialis level. Local law can vary tremendously, but it is usually rather punitive, shall we say, or perhaps stratified is the more correct term. The majority of imperial worlds are ruled over by an entrenched aristocracy. Obviously, they will write laws to favor themselves to a rather excessive degree, and as most planets tend to be run by more or less the same gathering of families for hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of years, they tend to have wrote the book quite exclusively for their own benefits. Now, Imperial citizens do, of course, have some rights. The right to not be just randomly murdered, for example. Although, even then, if the social difference is large enough, it is entirely possible that a noble can simply pay off a debt, for example, for murdering a local. Alternatively, there are also differing definitions on what is and is not a citizen. For example, many planets have a large mutant population. Even if they are considered relatively stable, they are nevertheless unclean, and will have very few, if any, rights whatsoever, or even basic protections from the law. And speaking of rights, Imperial citizens have few rights. Again, it will vary from world to world, but you are very, very, very rarely, if ever, going to see anything like our world's social security system, for example. There exists no such thing as a right to liberty or freedom of expression. No, definitely no. Most assuredly, no. You may have the occasional privilege, like again, just not being murdered or robbed from randomly, but when it comes to actual freedoms that places you above the state or the ruling classes, there really is not going to be much of that at all. So you could certainly make a fairly valid argument that the average Imperial citizen is a bit oppressed. Now, on the bright side, there is, at the very least, some basic level of protection of property. You can own things, and those things are your things. And granted, if the local, baron comes asking for it, then you're probably gonna have to give it up in the end, but you should theoretically at least be compensated for it. Theoretically. Again, this is one of those cases where we can generalize quite broadly. If the guy that wants something from you, or is predating upon you, is of a significantly higher social standing than you, then you probably have very few, if any, rights. If he is of equal or merely a little bit higher standing than you, then you might very well have some sort of legal recourse. Potentially. And hey, you know, actually, some of the more feral worlds might even have better legal protections than the more civilized ones. At least there, usually, the fundamental truth is might makes right. So, if you feel confident in your ability to beat the son of the mayor to death with a stick, well, you might as well try. And that leads us to our final topic for consideration: social class. So, we've been talking in fairly ephemeral terms up until this point, simply because without addressing social class, there is very few real guesses we can make. But let us now begin with the lowest of the low, those who will have access to virtually nothing beyond a hole they can dig in the ground, those deprived of virtually all legal protections, the outcasts. These are non-members of Imperial society, like aforementioned mutants. They are not protected by Imperial law in virtually all circumstances, although there is at least one I remember where the mutants did have some basic protections, but even then, it simply amounted to you can't be killed purely for sport. So, yeah. These people are unlikely to live long or healthy lives. In fact, they're probably worse off than a good number of chaos cultists on chaos-held worlds. They are actively despised and looked down upon and will not even be able to get decent work. They will be scraping a living, if even able to get a living at all. Above them are the actual citizens, members of Imperial society. They will have at least some basic legal protections and will probably be able to find some form of employment. In fact, if anything, the usual problem is that there are too many jobs available, which means that the pay for each one tends to be rather pathetic, and many find themselves working multiple jobs just to be able to survive. This is where the whole 12-hour shifts come into play. Most of these citizens work thankless jobs for very, very long hours with very, very little rest. Their comfort level is quite low. More often than not, they will be sharing a domicile with half a dozen other individuals, and they'll have access to basic technologies like an oven, for example, some cookery, some cutlery, and that sort. Nothing fancy. There are no microwaves in Warhammer 40,000, or, well, actually, there are, but not at this level, anyways. You won't be living in a hole in the ground, which is significantly better than the outcasts, and at least you'll have the opportunity to actually heat your food, which is, again, significantly better than the outcasts, but you're certainly not going to be living in the lap of luxury anytime soon, and your opportunities for ever escaping this state of affairs are very, very limited. Your only real hope is long and hard work, attempting to climb up the social ladder within your form of employment, assuming there even is a ladder to be climbed within your particular form of job. If you're simply the guy that moves boxes into smaller boxes, well, no matter how good you get at moving boxes, there really isn't all that much in the way of upwards mobility available, if you get my drift. Above the average civilian is those with a settled form of employment, something that's not going to be going away, and something that does have upwards mobility. This is things like adepts of the administratum, for example, or people working in law enforcement, or even in the PDF. Those that are in lines of employment where you can actually rise through the ranks with at least, some degree of freedom. These usually start at a level not much, if indeed any better, than that of the average civilians, living in small domiciles shared with several other individuals. Barely subsistence level living, and many do indeed die due to harsh training situations and conditions. For example, if you are working in a guild, then, well, there are very good odds that there's going to be a tremendous amount of very heavy machinery all around you. Very heavy machinery that you will have an absolute bare minimum of training in operating, and yet you will be expected to operate it. In fact, in many cases, especially if you're a younger individual, they might find special uses for you, like crawling in underneath the running machinery to pick pieces out of it, or to get rid of things that have stuck. This actually happened historically. They would send children in under the machines because, well, they were small and had tiny little hands that could easily get into the cracks. The fact that the child was also more than often than not mauled by this, well, you gotta occasionally break some eggs, you know? Additionally, these very young adepts are not going to be treated with a tremendous amount of respect by anyone. Indeed, more than likely, the rite of passage for a lot of these jobs is being bullied out of your fucking mind for a very, very, very long time, and probably in extremely hazardous ways as well. And if you somehow still survive and attain the rank of actual machine operator, or whatever it is you're being trained to do, only then will you receive some respect and be able to live at least a pinch more easily and safely, because now you can order other children to do the terrible things you were ordered to do. And so the shit continues to roll downhill. But as unfortunate as this situation may initially seem, within a guild, you may very well rise up through the ranks. You may start out as a simple machine operator, but eventually you'll become very skilled at operating your particular piece of machinery, assuming again that it requires a certain degree of finesse or knowledge. This might put you in a position to teach others. It might even put you in a position to direct others. Inside of organizations that are particularly large, like the Administratum, there is even a way to rise all the way up to straight-up managerial positions, where you will instruct several dozens other people. You may start out as a simple scribe hammering away at an archaic keyboard, and eventually end up bossing around hundreds of people hammering away at equally archaic keyboards. This will also see a significant improvement in your own living situation, all the way from simple subsistency to actually relatively decent luxury. A mid-level employee in one of these larger organizations like the Administratum will have access to a decent degree of luxury. Things like private living arrangements, perhaps things like specialized ovens, or the aforementioned microwaves. Even perhaps access to private entertainment devices like radios or TVs or, holotapes and voxcasters, etc. But you get my drift. They may even, if they rise sufficiently far, be given large private abodes with all manners of luxuries, including servants. In fact, there is even the possibility of retirement. Now, most Imperial citizens work until they are literally physically incapable of doing so, after which they will probably starve to death unless they have a big and supportive community around them to take care of them, and in return probably extract some other service from them, like the previous example about the old people being the ones doing the baking, whilst everyone else was working. But we know for a fact that the Administratum have actually retired several people in the past. which sounds absurd, but I need to mention it because there are such a thing as retirement worlds. Particularly accomplished and valuable Imperial servants will sometimes be sent to special planets to live out their days in, outright luxury, frankly. These are usually paradise worlds, which means that they're relatively free of starvation and invasion in the 41st millennium, and might even be pretty without being covered in endless rolling clouds of poisonous smog. So, take the word paradise with a certain pinch of salt, but nevertheless, it's a hell of a lot better than the overwhelming majority of places in the Imperium. Unless the subservient class rise up and stab you to death in the middle of the night, which has happened on more than one occasion, but still, it's a hell of a lot better than the majority of places in the Imperium yet again. And the simple opportunity to live out your last days only doing light work, or even, quite possibly, could it be no work? That is a hell of a lot more than 99.9% of the Imperium's population could ever possibly hope for. The only ones who can normally hope for that are the very rich and the nobility, which will make up our final class of citizenry. We'll begin with the very rich, because there is at least a theoretical possibility of an average citizen becoming a very rich individual. It's a snowball's chance in hell, but it is a chance. These people will have access to, well, anything money can buy. On some worlds, that might be a hell of a lot more restrictive than others, particularly on planets with very, very stringent and entrenched nobilities. They don't like uppity newcomers. They really, really don't. And unless you've got something to hold over their heads, like them owning you vast quantities of cash, for example, you're unlikely to ever be accepted within their world, or even be able to really live in the way that your means might allow you. But on most Imperial worlds, incredibly rich people are valued for, well, being incredibly rich people, and for all of the things that incredibly rich people can do, both for themselves, their friends, and society at large. As the Imperium too, of course, need people to sponsor the building of factories, of all of the things that modern civilization require. They need landowners and people to organize the farms and agri-worlds, etc., etc., etc. And of course, being ludicrously rich in the context of an interstellar civilization, it can be a lot. We are talking entire trade empires that run, own, and operate their own fleets of starfaring vessels, carrying bajillions of tons of goods in and out of star systems. Or potentially people with the power to run private armies. Some of these rich, mercantile barons possess enough power, wealth, and privilege to purchase literal continents for their very own private amusement. So, yeah, rich people in the Warhammer 40,000 universe can get really, really rich. To the point where all the aforementioned luxuries are just everyday, normal things. But at least the merchants can potentially lose access to these privileges. Just as one may climb the ladder, one may fall down it as well, but not so for the nobles, of course, as their lives of luxury are automatic. They don't need to work for it, they don't need to strive for it, they are born into luxury. And the luxury of an Imperial noble is significant. Not only do you have access to all of the usual creature comforts you can imagine, even in the modern world, things like private cogitators, for example, which would be an extreme rarity in the overwhelming majority of the Imperium. Having your own computer, only the highest level of administratum or guild officials would have access to such absurd luxuries. Or, again, the nobles. Food, you don't need to worry about that. You have chefs to take care of it. And endless quantities of servants to tickle your every fancy whenever you require it. The only real thing that can seriously interfere with a noble's life of absolute luxury is, well, invasion, That'll do it, either from outside forces or equally, if not more common, from the lower classes. Now, fortunately, Imperial nobles aren't complete idiots, and they've been doing this whole oppressing the peasantry thing for a very long time, and they've figured out that a monopoly on force is usually the best way to do so. Thus, they will have their own planetary defense forces swear loyalty to them. They will usually have their own palace guards and armed servants, their own private armies in essence, and they will be very eager to limit the access to any of these things to anybody else. The only real outside danger then would come from, well, the Imperium at large, and so long as the Imperium gets its tithe, it does not give two shits about what a planetary lord does to his peasantry. The Imperium, so long as, again, the lord does not interfere or break the Lex Imperialis, they are utterly neutral. They can carry out the most heinous ethnic cleansing campaigns you can imagine. They can ritualistically torture the shit out of their own populace, and nobody will care. In fact, as we talked about with the Ordo Famulus, there are cases in which ridiculously sadistic lords are not only allowed to retain power, but actively protected simply because, well, torturing a peasant to death weekly is, frankly, a pretty minor problem on a planetary scale. If the rest of the world runs well, if it meets its tithes and the general populace is fed and happy and unaware of the frequent bouts of sadistic torture sex going on in the expansive dungeons beneath the palace, then, well, hey, he's doing his job. It's not the Imperium's duty or role to judge his private sex life and all of that. Now, again, the Ordo Famulus would prefer it if these proclivities too were at the very least kept secret, or, even better, bred out of the familiar lineage due to the complications that could easily ensue were aforementioned proclivities to be made public. Yeah, worlds have fallen for less. But still, that's not a problem, so long as you're nice and quiet about it. And the best part is, Imperial nobles are barely even expected to do work. All a noble really has to do is appoint the correct people to do what must be done. Nobody expects the Imperial governor to sign every document, to oversee every shipment, to make sure that the farms are producing on time. All they expect is that whenever one of these things fail to meet expectations, that he will yell at whoever runs the guild or larger organization responsible for that shortfall, and if necessary, fire him. Or have him publicly executed, whichever is more effective at the time. However, this is of course not, by any stretch of the imagination, the regular lives of average Imperial citizens. As, once more, 99% of aforementioned citizens will find themselves on the receiving end of the local lord's abuses of power. But there is a certain advantage in numbers, certain power in anonymity. You're quite unlikely to be picked to be your local lord's playmate for the weekend. Your chances of rising to fame and fortune might be equally small, but hey, silver lining, the probability of becoming a victim of a sadomasochistic governor too are fairly small. Unless, of course, the food riots have awoken the cults again, in which case, yeah, that tends to eat society from the bottom rather than the top. But that has been my long and ranting explanation on what life is like for an Imperial citizen. And even now we've been somewhat generic, because, of course, we haven't touched about what happens when, well, aforementioned cults, for example, start rising all around you, or during invasions or times of war or hardship and so on. That might be its own entire subject. But for now, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.